Hello. So the first thing we're going to do, the first piece of real content for today's lecture, is we're going to talk about the strategy that Ekaterina Hardim and her co-authors used to try to estimate the effect of a minimum wage increase in C. Okay. So the first thing to point out is there were a couple of places where we were a little bit concerned about Carden-Kruger's results, right? Where it was a little bit difficult to know how to interpret what Carden-Kruger found. So the first thing, potentially the biggest thing here, is that the strength of Carden-Kruger's paper is that they're comparing identical establishments or similar franchises on one side of the state border to the other, right? So they're comparing Burger Kings in Pennsylvania to Burger Kings in New Jersey, Roy Rogers in New Jersey to Roy Rogers in Pennsylvania. And that gives us some comfort in our common trends assumption because it's easier to believe that not much would have changed the employment rates of Burger King workers, Burger King franchises in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania, if not for that minimum wage increase, than it would be to believe that about random businesses on either side of the border, right? Essentially, by restricting the analysis to fast food franchises, Carden-Kruger are able to say that their common trends assumption is really just an assumption that there wasn't some other change in demand for burgers or some change in the availability of labor that affected one state versus the other than the minimum wage increase, right? So that's the advantage of doing that. The disadvantage of doing that is that it makes us wonder how representative fast food workers are of minimum wage workers as a whole, right? And as we talked about on Tuesday's lecture, we might worry, for instance, that because low-wage workers make up a large share of fast food franchise employment, that demand for fast food franchise workers might be more elastic, right, using Marshall's laws of demand. On the other hand, we might worry that by the nature of franchise businesses, franchise owners might have less flexibility in how they replace workers when workers get more expensive than do other kinds of business owners, right? In order to be a franchise, you need to run your business in a certain way. You need to have a certain kind of line management. You need to have a certain kind of kitchen organization. And all of that might make it harder for you to say, you know, the curly fries really take too much work. We're going to cut curly fries out of our menu. So as a result, right, we might want to think, would we see the same results if instead of just looking at fast food workers, we looked at everybody who earns a minimum wage? On the other hand, you know, so another thing we might think about is Carden-Kruger find a positive employment effect from an increase in minimum wages from $4.25 to $5.05. Maybe there would have become negative employment effects had we continued to increase the minimum wage past that point, right? And then the last thing is, maybe the reason that they don't find a negative effect on minimum wages is because the negative effect on employment happened before the minimum wage went into effect, right? We know that the minimum wage was planned about 2 years before it actually went into effect in New Jersey. So one potential criticism of Carden-Kruger is that maybe fast food managers, rather than laying people off when the minimum wage went into effect, just stopped hiring for a while before the minimum wage went into effect. And that's why New Jersey franchises had lower levels of employment before the minimum wage than did Pennsylvania. So we're going to attack some of these questions. We're going to investigate some of these questions further by looking at a paper that uses a new minimum wage context and uses some new methods. So Hardim and her co-authors, right, are going to analyze a minimum wage increase that happened in stages in the city of Seattle, 2015. So essentially what Seattle did, before 2015, Seattle had a fixed minimum wage that was the state minimum wage of $9.47 an hour. And they passed a law in 2015 that was increasing the minimum wage in increments up until a maximum minimum wage, a final minimum wage of $15 an hour. This came out of the fight for 15. So there's a couple of things that distinguish this from the New Jersey experience. So the first thing is that the minimum wage in Seattle started higher than the minimum wage in New Jersey ended, and it increased more. So minimum wage of $5.05 an hour, adjusted for inflation, would be about $8.58 an hour in 2015. So about $1 an hour less than the original minimum wage in Seattle. On top of that, the increase from $4.25 to $5.05 is about an 18% increase in the minimum wage. An increase from $9.50 to $13 an hour is a 37% increase in the minimum. So Seattle increased its minimum wage more, and it increased it from a higher baseline. On top of that, right, it might be the case that because Seattle is a single city, the labor demand in a city might be more elastic than labor demand in a state, because it might be easier for businesses to move out of Seattle and into the suburbs than it would have been to have businesses move out of New Jersey and into neighborhoods. This might be a little bit less of a concern because of the fact that we looked at New Jersey, which is a small and densely populated state, right, with neighbors on, with neighbors that you could easily move a business to. But this is still something that could potentially lead to different results. So just to lay out what the Seattle minimum wage increase looks like, what you can see is that on January 1st in 2015, the ordinance goes into effect. At this point, minimum wages are $9.47 an hour. All businesses increased their minimum wages to about $11 an hour in April of 2015, with the exception of small employers whose workers got tips or healthcare benefits, who only had an increase to $10 an hour. Then the minimum wage increased again in 2016 to $13 an hour for large employers, and lower wages for employers that offer benefits and are small, and then reaches a final wage of $15 an hour for everyone at various times. And this paper is going to look at the first two moves here, right? So the move from $9.50 an hour to $11, and from $11 an hour to $13. Okay. They're also going to use some different strategies than the ones used by Card and Krueger. So the first thing, and maybe the most important, is that they're not going to try to estimate the effective and minimum wage by defining a market as a certain kind of industry, right? So looking at something like fast food franchises, or a certain kind of worker. So for example, looking at teenagers. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to define low-wage workers as workers that are earning below a threshold amount. So they're going to say, if you earn less than $19 an hour, we're going to lump you into a market that we call the low-wage labor market, and we're going to look at the effective minimum wages on the number of hours and the number of workers in that broadly defined low-wage labor market. So the advantage of this is we move away from this problem of having to wonder how representative the fast food sector is of low-wage workers as a whole. We also move away from the problem of potentially lumping in workers that aren't affected by a minimum wage with workers who are, right? So if we do something like look just at the wages and employment of teenagers, see that some teenagers are actually earning well above minimum wages and aren't affected by minimum wage. Likewise, if we did something like look at the fast food sector as a whole, or even more so the restaurant sector as a whole, we would potentially be lumping in workers who are earning significantly more than a minimum wage, and therefore seeing a smaller effect than really existed. Right, so the advantage of this is it's going to be more closely targeted to the workers we care about. The disadvantage of this is that we would get biased results if the minimum wage increase resulted in people moving from below $19 an hour work to above $19 an hour, right? So if we see if somebody gets a better job, instead of earning $14 an hour, they earn $20 an hour, this paper would interpret that person as having lost their job or left the low-wage sector because there would be one fewer low-wage job, as opposed to getting a raise. So that's the reason that they set the threshold so high, right? Set the threshold at 19 rather than closer to the minimum wage itself, because they want to argue that while the minimum wage might have increased some people's wages past that threshold, right? When the minimum wage goes up to $13 an hour, maybe some employers are induced to raise their wages to $14 an hour, but it's unlikely that it's going to push people past $19 an hour. And they'll show some evidence that we'll look at later, trying to see whether that is believable or not. The second thing that they're going to do, the second innovation compared to the Card and Krueger paper, is that instead of using a standard difference in difference, where they say I've got Seattle and then I have another city that's going to act as a control group for Seattle, they're going to construct a synthetic Seattle out of all of the Washington counties that are not part of King County, the county that Seattle is in. We talked about this a little bit when we looked at the Muriel Boatlift paper, right, where we said because there's no city that's quite like Miami, instead of comparing Miami to one comparison city, let's compare it to the average of a whole bunch of cities, right? The average of LA and Atlanta and Tampa and Houston and maybe a few others, I don't quite remember. In the same way, we're going to say instead of comparing Seattle to one other Seattle versus Portland, we're going to construct kind of a Frankensteinian Seattle or a Bizarro Seattle out of all of the counties in Washington state other than Seattle. And the way that we're going to do this, instead of taking a simple average like the Muriel Boatlift paper did, we're going to choose a weight on each of those other counties that creates this Frankensteinian Seattle in a way that best represents the real Seattle. So we're going to choose the weights on those counties so that the trends in employment and the trends in earnings over time in Bizarro Seattle or Frankenstein Seattle, synthetic Seattle, look as similar as possible to the trends over time in real Seattle. So to show you what that looks like, if we did a difference in difference, some natural things to do would be to compare Seattle, which is this little purple lump right here, to the rest of King County, this red area, or compare Seattle to these yellow areas, right? So the counties around Seattle. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to compare Seattle, this purple lump, to a weighted average of all of these gray areas, all of these gray micro-statistical areas, which are basically every part of Washington state other than King County. And we're going to put a weight on each of these areas to construct a city that looks as much as possible like Seattle. So by doing this, the advantage of doing this is that we can believe our common trends assumption a little more because we've created a control group that actually had the same trends in employment and earnings as Seattle before the minimum wage went into effect, right? So it's easier for us to believe that it would have had the same trends in employment and earnings after the minimum wage in Seattle. On the other hand, it makes it a little bit harder to critique, right? If we're comparing New Jersey to Pennsylvania, then we have to ask, well, what else happened in New Jersey in 1992? What else happened in Pennsylvania in 1992, right? Do we really believe that New Jersey looks like Pennsylvania? When we're comparing Seattle to this amorphous gray mass, each chunk of which is given a different weight, it can be a little harder to know what stories would potentially cause bias, right? We would have to think very hard about what was happening in every single one of these regions and how that's going to play into our regression. So in some ways, it can be harder to analyze a synthetic control method. However, one thing I want to point out, if we look at basically the trend in wages in Seattle, which is in black, versus synthetic Seattle, which is in blue, what we're going to see is that Seattle and synthetic Seattle actually look very, very similar up until the first minimum wage increase goes into effect, at which point Seattle's wages go up. So this gives us some confidence that we are, in fact, doing better by having this synthetic control method. And the last thing they do is they say, let's look at the effect of a fake minimum wage increase, a placebo minimum wage increase. Let's pretend that the minimum wage went up in the middle of 2012 and see whether we would get accurate results, right? What we should get here is that the difference in difference estimate is 0 because there was no minimum wage increase, so there should be no effect of a fake increase. And what they say is if you did a difference in difference using the rest of King County or the neighboring counties as a control group, you would find significant effects on both employment and wages from this fake non-existent minimum wage increase. But if you use their synthetic Seattle, you're going to find tiny, tiny effects that are not statistically significant. And so that's going to give us a little bit more confidence that when we see real effects later, that this isn't just about Seattle and synthetic Seattle not being comparable. Okay, great. So that's what I'm going to say about their strategy. In the next video, I'm going to start thinking about how to analyze their results.